Welcome to Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance by voices within the independent Catholic movement. For more information on inclusive Catholicism, please visit extraordinarycatholics.faith. And now, meet your hosts, Reverend Dr. Trish Sullivan-Bonney and Reverend Dr. Jayme Matthias.
Welcome to Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. I'm Father Jayme Matthias.
And I'm Reverend Trish Sullivan-Bonney.
And for this episode, we're excited to welcome a special guest, Reverend Trish.
Well, this is a special guest for me because he is my colleague and partner in crime and ministry on a national level in our jurisdiction of this inclusive Catholic movement we're part of, the Ecumenical Catholic Communion. So I'm really delighted to welcome John Duffy-Burke to our podcast. He is the co-vice chair of our House of Laity. We have a bicameral leadership that meets every 2 years in synod, and we pass legislation, and we learn, and we grow, and we pray, and we vision for the future. And John and I are both in leadership roles. I'm the chair of the House of Pastors, and because we have those roles, we serve on something called the Leadership Council of our jurisdiction, which means we are we're 5 people who get to sit with our presiding bishop once a month and weigh in on issues and support him and talk about the future of our communion together. The reason I wanted to invite you on, John, is John and I first, met through the ECC, but we narrowly missed each other at the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley, California. I was there residentially as a PhD student of the Graduate Theological Union, and as such, I could affiliate with one of the many schools of the GTU. I think at the time there were 8 or 9 seminaries and schools of theology there. And so John was there, and he has, of course, in the process of being there, achieved the Master of Divinity degree, which is the gold standard for ordination. And of course, a lot of people who were at the JST then, and just like when I was at the St. John's School of Theology and Ministry up in Collegeville, lots of lay people were getting this degree, and not either didn't have access to ordination or chose to think of that equipping not as a path to ordination. And John has been an exemplar in our communion of how critical it is to continue to honor the Roman Catholic legacy of an empowered laity leading the church. To not start lapsing into a Protestant model where everybody under the sun is ordained, as I see among my Lutheran church colleagues here in my area of the country. No harm, no foul. That's how they do it. Everybody gets ordained and everybody becomes a leader. In the Roman Catholic system, we learned that lay people, through the dignity of their baptism and underlined by the teaching of Vatican II, have a very important role to play in leading the church. So I wanted John to come on to talk about that, to talk about why it's important for us to continue to hold that legacy. So John, welcome. I'm really delighted you're with us. I want to give you a chance to tell us a little bit about your setting, who you are, what you do. Just give us a little, I've been talking a little while here framing this. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and we'll kick off our questioning after that.
Thank you, Trish. I live in St. Louis with my wife, and I guess since we're talking about the laity and its role in the Catholic Church, I think it might be best if I tell a little bit about my story of how I came to discern a vocation to the lay state, is how I say it now. Mm-hmm. Because for a long time, I was discerning to be or not to be a priest, in part because I had lots of really dear priests in my life growing up. One was a Jesuit uncle who was kind of like, I grew up in Wyoming, and his visits were a little bit like Gandalf coming to the Shire. Like he was this really exciting person, and he would tell us stories, including The Lord of the Rings as a bedtime story. And so I had lots of positive role models of priesthood in my life, and also enjoyed the complexity of theological discussions from a young age, in part because I was included in them as an adult. And so I, yeah, off and on throughout my young adulthood would discern, be like, oh, like I'm really feeling like maybe I should be a priest. And I finished that process definitively during my first year of studying to get my MDiv at the Jesuit School of Theology, which I sort of thought of as a way of like, I'm really going to do this seriously. I'm going to study. I'm going to live next to a bunch of Jesuits who are in their final stages of formation. And what I really came to understand there was that like, I had been given this very broad view of what a priest could do, but not a very clear understanding of what a priest must do, of what was essential to the vocation of priesthood, which is preaching and sacramental ministry. And I had grown up with a stutter most of my life, so public speaking is something that I've had to really like lean into as an edge. And so like both of those were like the parts of what a priest could do that were the least interesting to me of the whole like cornucopia of what a priest could do. And then seeing so many of my peers as lay people planning to go into careers doing the parts of being a priest that I really was called to and attracted to, I was like, I don't have to be a priest. And then since I was doing this discernment in a Roman Catholic context, there are many also like there's a high cost to becoming a priest in terms of the legal jurisdictional requirements of celibacy and obedience. And so I and then so I discerned that I did not actually have a vocation to the priesthood. And it wasn't until later, a couple years later, I was having a discussion with my priest uncle, my Jesuit uncle, who said that he relayed a conversation that he had with a friend of his who was gay as a young man, where that friend challenged him, when was he going to come out as a straight man? And he was really confused, and he was telling this and he says, I was really confused about this. But his friend was like, like that just because your sexual identity is the default or the presumed sexual identity does not absolve you of the responsibility of discerning that and actually like actively saying like, how do I express this, particularly as a celibate priest? And my brain connected that to my discernment about priesthood and was like, oh, I've been thinking about this wrong. It's not whether or not I have a vocation to the priesthood. It's, do I have a vocation to ordained ministry, or do I have a vocation to lay ministry? And when I started thinking about the vocation to the laity, not as just like what happens to me if I don't get ordained, but actually as an active choice, and then really leaning into that creedal belief of ours that like in our baptism, we are all called to be priestess, prophetess, and queen, or priest, prophet, king. I've been trying to really reframe those, the way gendered terms have affected my religious imagination over the last 5 or so years. And so throughout this conversation, I'm going to be going back and forth because it's an ongoing process for me. But I have found that after using masculine pronouns throughout my religious vocabulary for 35, 40 years, if I really want to degender that imagination, I have to balance it out with not an equal amount of time, but a lot of time using feminine pronouns. So priestess, my vocational call to be priestess, prophetess, and queen. And that really, like, leaning into that like, even though I am not seeking ordination, I am called to sanctify my life. I am called to exercise leadership in my communities. And I am also called to like speak out against injustice, against and to also like announce the kingdom of God, and to help my community imagine how that can be real in our day and age.
Mm-hmm. That's so awesome, John. I love the way you express this. I didn't realize my bias around this until you and I were talking a couple of years ago. So it was a very unexplored bias on my part. I was a lay ecclesial minister in the Roman Catholic system for, a long time, and led national projects for the National Association of Lay Ministry, a huge Lilly Grant project with all kinds of research and outputs of books and things like that. Worked with all these different professional organizations of our lay ecclesial ministers in the Roman Catholic system. And yet, I didn't realize how much my default was, well, people are lay ministers because they can't access ordination in the Roman Catholic system. Like, if you had asked me, was that my default? I probably would have been stopped in my tracks. But I realized how much it was my default for two things. First of all, from my own experience as a woman getting an MDiv, and how many at that moment, I was at St. John's School of Theology and Ministry at the heyday of lay ecclesial ministers being enrolled. I think in 97, the data was something like 27,000 lay people in seminary settings, married and female, and other prohibitive identities, right? And so I was doing my MDiv from then until I finished it in 2002 because I was doing it part-time. Um, so but you and I were talking, and I knew you had an MDiv. And of course, in our movement, we're always eager to find those people who are fully equipped with legitimate preparation to invite them into the priesthood, because we're now in this wave now, at least in the ECC, of a lot of older clergy. How do we find the younger people? So I remember I had talked to your wife. I knew that she was your partner, she was very interested in being a priest. And then you're like, no, Trish, that's not my vocation. And I was like, what? You have an MDiv. And it wasn't until that conversation that it hit me that I was not honoring this really important development in the Roman Catholic community that I think is the work of the Holy Spirit, that the exclusionary practices actually raised up a very well-equipped cohort of people to be leaders in the church, and who were not going to be choosing the path of ordination. So, that's the background for me of my own bias. And I wonder, Father Jayme, in your context, here I am, I wrote my PhD on my dissertation on collaborative leadership. I'm supposedly somebody who has a huge commitment to this. I had this blind spot. I'm wondering, for you in your context, with lay people, what are you seeing, and what do we need to ask John about our movement honoring that piece of our history in a really positive way? So I'll kick it over to you.
Thank you, Reverend Trish. So I grew up in the middle of the cornfields of Ohio, and one of the memories that I have as a child is that during our CCD, or religious education classes, we would have our annual contest for religious vocation posters. I was a good artist, but really all of these religious vocation posters had something in common, and that they focused on priests and religious largely. Deacons were not so popular at the time that I was growing up in rural Ohio. But there was something that was very much missing about all of that strikes me to this day, and how it is that when we think of God's call, vocation, we think of priests and nuns, for instance, but we don't think about the millions of people that God has called to ministry from other states of life, which is just really a sad statement on the church, which is why, John, I just want to say that I really love the fact that your own vocation story and how you were discerning what life and ministry might look like for yourself. I love the story of your own cost-benefit analysis with respect to ordained ministry in the church. And I'm wondering how it is, John, that that perhaps you made this own shift within yourself. How is it you realize that holiness is not something that's simply reserved to clergy or religious? How it is that God calls all sorts of people to ministry within the church, and what that means for you? You know, this whole concept of lay vocation is really something that's quite new for us as a church to be wrestling with, really, since the Second Vatican Council and the universal priesthood of the faithful. It's a very relatively recent concept for us, and so I'm excited to have you here as a layperson sharing your perspective, John.
Thank you. My first degree, my bachelor's degree, is in foreign policy from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, and so that is I understand that, even though I've not pursued that as a career because of the high cost in moral terms. It's a lens that I understand most situations through, where I'm very attuned to the streams of power in communities and how it's exercised. And one of the things that, again, back when I was still in my MDiv studies, and I was thinking about the ecclesiology of the Roman Catholic Church, and I really had the sense of, like, if everyone who has the skills for leadership gets pushed into an ordination track and becomes part of the clerical class, then whenever there is any sort of like effort to redress sort of the imbalance between the laity and the priesthood in the Roman context, that there's going to be no leaders on one side. And so what you're going to have is, what we've seen is, people are just going to walk away because there's no one there to organize them and fight for their status within that institution. And so in discerning that of the three sort of like vocational calls, I was really feeling a strong call towards leadership, not necessarily in a public flashy way, because I can be shy, but sort of behind the scenes, the power behind the throne in Machiavellian terms. But or as a grassroots organizer to really help the lay folk really like organize and fight for the church that they want to stay in, instead of just melting away, which is what we have seen in that institution. And so for me, like, I think that it is vital that we have folks who are have the charisms, or have a strong vocational call to leadership in all walks of life in our communities, and that whenever which is hard, because our culture, the broader American culture that we live in, values specialization and professionalism. And so there's this idea of, like, we're going to have a leadership class, and we're going to have a creative class, and we're going to, instead of like a class that is like a little bit of everything, which is the class I want to be in, because I see something over there and I'm like, I want to learn how to do that. And I see something over there and I'm like, I want to learn how to do that. And so I think that for me, the realization that, like, if all of the people who have a strong sense of their baptismal vocation are told that the only way to express that is through getting ordained, then you're going to have a disempowered laity. And so to really emphasize, in our language, that that every person has a vocation. And I wonder if we even stop using the word vocation to refer to what we currently think of, like what you were describing, Reverend Jayme, about your about doing the posters growing up. If we think of that more as like as a particular charism of somebody's vocation, to be priest, prophet, and king, you know, um, I think that the yeah, and like I think of those as like every person has them in a different mix, kind of like you build your own parfait, and like you might have just a little bit of priesthood at the bottom and a lot of you know queenship in the middle, and you get a good sprinkling of prophetic vo vocation on top, and everybody's is different. And the real discernment process is to like identify that, like what, like am I really called to leadership with a strong side of prophetic action, or sanctifying and a strong side of leadership? Like what's the mix of those? And then to look at the career paths that have been laid out for us in the world, and be like, which career path best serves my particular vocational mix? And in the case of some folks, like it's going to be none of the above, and they're going to have to blaze a new career path, because and I think of the career paths sort of as like as a shorthand for the call of the community. Like the community has said, we need doctors, and so here's a career path as a doctor, instead of, which makes it easier to sort of facilitate that sort of process. But really, like, and and I think this is where we sometimes can go off the rails, is we think about vocation as something between us and Goddess, and not between us, Goddess, and our community. And so, like, despite my very strong commitment to like staying in the lay state, if it was necessary for my community to pray that I become ordained, I would do it, because that's the need, and I have the skills to do it. But we aren't there yet. There are others in our community that I believe have a stronger call to that sacramental role in our community.
Right. I want to kind of stay with that whole question of vocation and identity, and how the valences we've assigned to that. We talk about like a married vocation, and then the other half is professed or ordained vocation, right? That's how I was raised.
Right.
And that the truth is, I think about, as you were talking, John, I was thinking about the choices I made along the way. And I know that it's tied to power, so I don't want to disregard that. But in a way, it lived for me like franchise. So one of the issues for me as a woman in the Roman Catholic system was, how do I get in there and actually authentically lead? So I got an MDiv because I wanted to be in a parish context. Well, then I discovered that my MDiv basically would give me an opening to be a parish administrator. And that, I had run a company that might have been a good fit, a religious educator, or a pastoral minister. It was not going to allow me to be an organizational leader. And my career, I had been an entrepreneur. I'd run a company. I was used to running the business. So I went into like being a nonprofit director in two different ways in the course of that. Then I discovered that I was still very disregarded as a woman, that the clericalism was so intense, not only in the priests I dealt with, and I dealt with a lot of national organizations. I mean, I could give you a long alphabet soup of these wonderful organizations I dealt with, but they were all very, very tied into the leadership of their ordained. And then I thought, well, the only place that women really get taken seriously is in the academy. That was the thing that drove me to do my PhD. And I want to equip people to honor the collaborative nature of ministry and why it's so important, why we need to take our lay people seriously. because it was very easy, very facile. Other than this rarefied context of my home parish, I saw everywhere else that, lay people were not really taken seriously. On the other hand, lay people often were trying to overlay paradigms on church systems that I didn't know were so healthy. They were corporate paradigms, right? And so like they had to be untangled. So that's my backstory. And what I notice in our jurisdiction and throughout the movement is because we're all so small, right? Where most communities are, I mean, a big community in our movement is a 500 person community, 500 or, 100 households or whatever. If you look across the country, we have become very priest-centered in the movement. We have bishops who are pastoral leaders in their parishes. We have priests. We don't tend to have a lay staff of lay ecclesial ministers, a very hard fought for title. Um, so I'm worried that we're a little at risk of going into that Protestant paradigm where, every the cleric is the one who, says and does everything. Um, so, I don't have any answers. I'm just wondering if you have any insights about, in the movement, what do we need to be doing to engage the perspective you're articulating? I think it's critical that we honor the priesthood of all believers, that we deconstruct some of the power and control we've assigned to the vocation. I don't know if you have any insights, or Jayme for that matter. I'd love to hear.
For me, I often reflect on how difficult it is to achieve change, especially within large systems. And I'm just thinking that we, for so long, we have this centuries long history of clericalism in the church. And so to move from this history of clericalism, which we have carried on our shoulders for so long, now in the 1960s, for us to have received this vision of the universal call of holiness is just this fantastic. I mean, we refer to Vatican II as this time of opening the windows of the church and letting in some fresh air. Talk about the fresh air of this universal call to holiness. I think that there is so much that remains to be explored about that in light of the baggage that we continue to carry on our shoulders with respect to clericalism. I say that as the one on this podcast wearing the collar and assuming the weight of all of these centuries of distinction and titles. There's something about that history that I grieve. But at the same time, John, I think that you point us in directions that give me hope, because when I was reading the website of the community board that you serve on, it talked about you walking your dogs in Marquette Park. And I think there's just something holy about us looking for moments of holiness and spirituality in ordinary moments. That it's not about going to a church and connecting with God in that church so much as finding God in nature, with our pets, with our loved ones, with family and friends, at work, wherever we find ourselves. One of the great insights, I think, since the Second Vatican Council with our reclaiming of the diaconate has been how it is that the deacons have served as sort of this bridge between this clerical world that we continue to carry into the future, but also between the world in which we live and how it is that I know that when we started reclaiming the diaconate, deacons were seen to be sort of be the salt of the world, going off to their places of work and living family life, but then coming and also modeling for us what that means in terms of ministry in the church. So, John, I just want to kick it back to you and have you tell us, since that website refers to you walking your dogs in Marquette Park, how is it that you find God in ordinary moments, and what it is that might be able to tell us as we continue to reclaim the universal holiness of all of God's people?
Thanks, Jayme. I also want to touch real quick on Trish's point about the way that power works and affects us based on how we present, and acknowledge that I am a white, straight, cisgendered male, and that I have a lot of cultural power because of that. And I think that increases the impact of my choice to honor my lay vocation, because it is so odd because all of those other, I have access to ordination in the Roman Catholic context. And that was really challenging to some of my Jesuit classmates who were like, why don't you just become a priest? And so I think that, and to your point, Jayme, we do have a very long history of that we need to deconstruct. And the lay people are as responsible for clericalism in our movement as the priests are. There's a lot of internalized clericalism. When I first started serving in a leadership capacity in the ECC, in the House of Laity, very frequently, as a group of lay people, someone would ask, like, well, maybe we should ask the bishop what he thinks about that, or we should ask the House of Pastors what they think about that. And the iconoclast in me was like, no, we are the laity, and it's given to us to make this decision, and like, let's just do it. Let's stop giving away our power. And for me, I think, like your point about finding the holy in everyday life is really important, because even though I'm not pursuing ordination and expressing my vocation, my priestly vocation through ordination, I am sanctifying my life on a daily basis through walking my dog in the park. One of those dogs is now 16 years old, and she is on the long glide path to death. And my wife and I are really like tending to that, and really, like she has been present to us in our life for the last 16 years. And so to really be present to her as in her last years, like there's a lot of holiness there. I'm the primary cook in our household, and I love to, make delicious food for people and serve it to them. In fact, once a month, I just invite anyone I can think of over for a big dinner and make a giant pot of soup and serve it to them. And, that's sacramental. Um, you know, in theology school, they would have said small s, sacramental, but it's sacramental. It is presiding at table. It is, um, and then I work with my hands in my day job, is how I earn my bread. And, like that feels deeply sacred to me, because it is a process of shaping the world around me. And I don't do it perfectly. There are days where I rush through it, and like I get to the end of the day and I'm just exhausted and beaten. I don't know what I did. But there are other days where I'm able to be really present to the task and really allow it to be an expression of my humanness to shape the world around me. And I think that is the right and capacity of every layperson. And then in terms of like really like lifting us up within our movement, I think that part of it is recognizing that the lay folk were really busy, and so to take a job or task that was designed for someone who has like, that is going to treat it as like a part-time job, and then to find an individual to take that on as an extracurricular activity on top of running a household and earning a living and being a good friend and family member. You're just not going to find a lot. But if you can break those tasks up and spread it out across 10 of us, you get 10 times the wisdom. And so part of it is like, like breaking tasks up or assignments, and really recognizing that like the strength of the laity is the breadth of our experience, but our real weakness is our limited availability. Jayme, it looked like you wanted to jump in and say something.
John, there's just something so beautiful about how it is that all of us are called to bridge our faith and our spirituality to the lives in which we find ourselves. I'm recalling back in the seminary, Sister Teresa Kernke was famous for saying, prayer is not just about being with Jesus in a nook with a book and a vigil light. And the more that I studied, for instance, Latin American liberation theology, the more I realized that, for them, they were sort of critiquing these traditional models of prayer, where it's us withdrawing from the world and recharging our spiritual batteries to go back out into the world, so much as the concept that we learned from Latin American liberation theology was contemplation in action. How it is that regardless of what we're doing, especially when we're out in the world advocating for justice and peace, that is prayer. That is our spirituality in action. So there's just something beautiful about how it is that lay people more than ever are becoming attuned to how it is that what they are doing day to day is holy, right? Raising kids, cooking meals, doing laundry, going to work, supporting families, right? Contributing to the world in countless ways. That is the universal call to holiness right there.
Yeah, and when we think about some of us in the movement really grab onto the old Catholic identity. That's what we are. And that doesn't live for me as a realistic part of my formation. I didn't even know those words until practically I was ordained. Um, my formative reality is the experience of the American Church and the experience of integrating Vatican II, as I talk about ad nauseum in the settings we're in. So John knows my spiel about that. But, in the documents, the laity are called to be leaven in the world. While I really celebrate the development of lay ecclesial ministry in that context, because it allows people to do exactly what you did, John, which is discern what are my gifts and how do I bring that into, if I'm called to church leadership, how will I express that? Right? Either
Yeah.
as a member of a community mobilizing ministry, or as somebody who's gotten an enfranchised role in the community mobilizing ministry. But I remember when I was doing the Levin Center, and it was named after that foundational metaphor in Vatican II that the laity are leaven in the world. The head of the National Center for the Laity in Chicago really called me out. He's like, why are you focusing so much on the church? Your job should be to empower people to really see their ministry in the world as of equal dignity, and importance, and I was being really pushed by the people. We were really trying to mobilize better ministry in Roman Catholic settings. So there was a reason I was focusing that way. But he really gave me pause. How do we continue to develop this reality? I was very influenced in my PhD studies by Kenan Osborne, a very well-known Franciscan who wrote extensively on the dignity of the lay vocation. So it's sort of a both and for me. And I am spoiled because like I said, our family of origin was this Roman Catholic Church, 6,000 households, one priest. And the reason there was one priest there was punitive. He was too progressive for the archdiocese, so they kept withholding an associate from him. So as a result, his collaborative vision got operationalized in spades because we couldn't have done that place without that. And there were national ministries that emerged out of that parish, led by lay people, including the one that I led, and the lay preaching ministry, which was all over the United States, Partners in Preaching, which was later dismantled by a different bishop. So um, you know, I inherited leaders that were formed in that way. They are, the folks here at Caris, almost to a person, the founding members had multiple empowered roles in their Roman Catholic setting. My question now is, how do we continue to develop that in our movement? How do we not then turn, like I have an amazing 23-year-old who, is clearly has the gifts to be a priest. Well, I immediately went to that. I didn't stop and say, Bryce, what's your vocation? I didn't stop. I didn't think that. I went to, do you think you'd ever could see yourself being a deacon? I did. Me, who should have way more critical consciousness around that. So, I don't know what the answer is. except to continue to converse about it and also to continue to empower people, like you were describing, that internalized clericalism. What would Father think? You know, it's still there, even in an empowered body like that. Our leadership group of the House of the Laity, that is an empowered body. And yet there's still that, I don't know, that DNA, that bone marrow that's so Roman that it's hard for us to remember the new way. I don't know what the question is there, but
No worries,
Jayme.
Trish. I'm happy to jump in, John. We've started something here on Cutting Edge Catholics podcast that we call our Cutting Edge Catholics Questionnaire. It's modeled off of Stephen Colbert's Colbert Questionnaire, if you're familiar to that. It's a lightning round of 12 questions. You just say what comes to mind, and it helps us to better know you as a person, John. How does that sound?
Uh, that sounds great. I would like to just do a real quick
Please.
snippet. Um, I think, Trish, like you holding up this image of leaven, I have started to think of us more as mycelium, which is the main body of a fungus. Like what we think of as a fungus is like less than 5% of the total biomass of the fungus. Um, what the fungus is it's a network stretching through the soil for sometimes tens or even hundreds of miles. They are some of the largest living organisms on the planet, and the mycelium is the network, and it interfaces with the rest of the forest to help the fungus get the resources that it needs. But it also breaks down the world around it to have resources to trade with the rest of the forest. And so to think of the laity as mycelium going out into the world, and in some cases breaking down hard rock, is really a profound image for me, because it interfaces well with John Sobrino and Latin American liberation's theologies, sort of image of the world being ruled by empire, and that there's the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of the evil one, and that they are, in that there's a struggle between them, and the laity go out into the empire as mycelium and are able to break it down. And so like I think that lay ecclesial ministry is like really vital for our church, particularly as a way for lay people to exercise a more concentrated leadership role. But I think we really need to focus on the fact that like 95% of lay people are going to be lawyers, doctors, like they're
Mhm.
not going to be lay ecclesial ministers. They are going to be professionals in other career paths, but they're going to be doing that as baptized Christians, which means that they bring that vocation of priestess, prophetess, and queen into that field to break down the structures of empire that hold us in structural sin. Um,
Yeah,
and
I
that's
love
the
that
one thought.
metaphor. I love that metaphor. And and it's just a reminder for everyone who's dialed in or listening who preaches the gospel, to constantly ask ourselves the question of, what is the intersection between the life of this community, the text, and my own world of formation and insight that empowers people to go across the threshold and be the church. That we have to constantly keep that in our radar, that what are we are, we come together in that moment to fill up and fuel up and love one another and remind ourselves who we are and remind ourselves who Jesus Christ is for us. But it's all in service to the world, right? And we can lose track of that, and we can lose track of that in our movement too, because I know I get distracted by lots of little internal issues. And I'll tell you, the months we were fighting Metro Surge here in Minnesota were a real wake-up call to me and to our entire community about what fuels your activism matters, and that we all began to really think, well, what is it that calls me out to protest at the airport, to drive someone to their workplace, to stand at a bus stop at minus 10-degree weather, and to really begin to see that collectively as our priesthood and our call to manifest the love of God wherever we're found. It was very transformative for our community. I would not wish it on anybody on some level. And it really helps. So just a reminder before we get to the 12 questions, Jayme loves the 12 questions, that, as we preach and we teach and we lead in the movement, to keep honoring both the external vocation and the internal vocation of the laity, and to think about where do I participate in maintaining structures of power and control, and where do I where do I empower the spirit being let loose? I can't let the spirit loose, but I certainly can, take the keys that I'm holding that are keeping the door locked and flip the lock, right? So now we've got the 12 questions, which are really fun, and we don't want Jayme to not have an opportunity to ask them. So Jayme, back to you and the 12 questions.
John, this is our Cutting Edge Catholics Questionnaire. Are we ready?
I'm ready.
Favorite scripture passage, John?
Oh. I would say the entire Sermon on the Plain. So the Beatitudes, but Luke's version.
Yeah. Coffee, tea, or something stronger?
All of the above.
A favorite saint?
Oscar Romero.
Introvert or extrovert?
Introvert,
Favorite
but highly socialized.
Ooh. Favorite theologian or spiritual writer?
Um, my wife, and a close second would be probably Pierre Teilhard de Chardin.
What keeps you grounded?
Um, Doing things with my physical body. So oftentimes walking the dogs, but cooking grounds me a lot. Like I am physically like using all five of my senses. Like that is the most grounding thing for me, is like getting out of my head and into my physical um, incarnate space.
A neighborhood smell, sound, or sight that feels sacred to you?
Um, I would say the sound of children playing in the street. We have a lot of like large groups of like 10 kids that just like go out and play all summer long, and um, they create quite the racket.
If Jesus walked through Dutchtown, St. Louis, Missouri today, where would he spend most of his time?
Probably at the pool in Marquette Park.
One thing lay people misunderstand about themselves?
Um, that they are the church.
One word describing the church today.
Um, Ever new.
One word describing what the church could become.
Uh, Transformative.
And finally, a final word for listeners trying to live faithful lives in exhausting times.
Um, be gentle with yourselves. You get to have days off, and that this is not about spiritual perfectionism. And at the end of the day, it's not about us. Like, sometimes like like we have to break down so that there's room for the Holy Spirit, because we've been so trained to like do it, do it, do it. If I don't do it, it won't happen. And to actually like um relax and create space. And this is particularly for me as a white man, to actually like step back and create space and see what fills that space, rather than filling it with whatever's in my brain. Um,
John, thank you. As Stephen Colbert would say, you are now known. I'll kick it back over to Reverend Trish. Reverend Trish, how's the Spirit moving in your heart?
Well, we always like to do a kind of last words, John. So I'll kick it off and I'll give it to Jayme and then back to you. So Thank you for sharing the platform because I feel like I said a lot more even than I usually say, but this is an area of great passion for me as well, as you know. I am grateful for you in my life. I'm grateful for your witness. I'm grateful for your presence in the communion, in terms of how you're modeling the vocation, and your clarity. And I really am passionate that we continue to think about how our new structures can retain the best of our family of origin. And I actually think, when I was coming up, in ministry, that we were talking about a lot about vocation crisis, vocation crisis. We didn't have a vocation crisis. We're overflowing with vocations. They just didn't look as they had looked traditionally. There were times that the seminaries were overflowing. They were not worrying about, whether or not they, had, how many full-time students they had. It was happening in the late 90s. So, to say, like, how do we retain that is a really, really important question for the movement. And I'm really grateful you came on and could illuminate it for us a little bit. Jayme, what are your final words with our friend John?
John, thank you for joining us today. I'm just very moved by how it is that we're in the middle of a paradigm shift that's going to take some time for us to get through from, the clericalism of centuries to now this vision that we first heard in the 1960s of this universal call to holiness. It's going to take a while for us to fully realize what it means to recognize how it is that all of God's people are the light of the world and the salt of the earth. But just to see you and others doing it in such concrete ways, stepping up to help to lead the House of Laity of the Ecumenical Catholic Communion, and in your daily life, the shepherding that you're doing, for instance, with your dog and or dogs, I just think is such a beautiful symbol. Pope Francis so often used various images of accompaniment, and there's just something beautiful about how it is that all of us, regardless of our state in life, are accompanying and walking with one another. So, John, know my gratitude for you here today. It's our custom to give you the last word, John.
Thank you, Jayme. I'm very glad to have been able to be here and to do this with you all. It has been a lot of fun, and I think that I often, somewhat tongue in cheek, will say that I had to get an MDiv to stay Catholic. That, and again, particularly in a Roman Catholic context, that I needed that level of formation in order to not be so scandalized by the narrow prescriptive version of the tradition that was being presented by the bishops in the early 2000s. Like I needed an MDiv in order to like have enough confidence in myself to be like, there's more. Like that's not the whole tradition, and then to lean into like the this movement of independent churches that are very small and do not have the same energy of a 1,600 person parish, but to really like see like the work of the Holy Spirit in this, in its very smallness. And I dream of a day where like our formation of the laity in the pew is such that someone like me doesn't have to get an MDiv to know their own power as a layperson. Yeah, I mean, like that's an expensive endeavor, even with a full ride scholarship. Um, because living costs money. So I think that to really we have to embody it in a way, and to prioritize an education of all the baptized faithful that is a functional ed education that allows them to discern for themselves what what Goddess is calling them to be in this world, and that's more than just like like 10 words that you can rattle off. Like that's a good starting point, but like we really need to like think about really robust formation of all baptized people. And until we have that, and starting just with like this, like how we talk about vocation. It's not, do you have a vocation? It's what is your vocation? And it's not your career path. It's what is this mix of sanctifying, leading, and teaching that you are called to do. And then we'll find the career path that helps you express that.
That's so great, John. So thank you, John Duffy-Burke, co-vice chair of the House of Laity of the Ecumenical Catholic Communion, partner in life to the amazing Aaron, dog walker, activist, handyman, and major mycelia. Is that the singular of a mycelium? I'm hoping.
Yeah.
In the world.
That's right.
It was great to have you with us. Thank you, listeners. Thank you for joining us on Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. I'm Trish Sullivan-Vani.
And I'm Father Jayme Matthias.
And we are delighted that you joined us. Go out there and find your fungus. Oh, that's terrible. Go out there and extend yourself as leaven, mycelia in the world.
Thank you for joining us for Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. For more information on inclusive Catholicism, please visit extraordinarycatholics.faith. Keep the faith.